Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Pauline von Bonsdorff, and I'm a professor of art education at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. It's now the 1st of November, and we have a lot of snow here at the moment, so not the summer that you can see in the image. But let me show it to you better. This is a toddler and his grandmother. The toddler is actually my son, although he's a bit older now, and the grandmother is my now late mother. And what is important here for the topic of aesthetics in childhood is that the child is actually a very active person, and this is something that we know from infant research already, and I'm going to talk more about it. But children are. We don't need to teach children about aesthetics or art. They, so to say, do it naturally. Well, this might sound a bit provocative, but and of course we are all human beings, are cultural beings. So of course it has an effect how you do it and with whom and so on. But so here you see it's a child. It's the little boy who is the director of the play. He was playing at the sandbox, and he has been making food, and he wants his grandmother to taste it, and he's very content when she kind of does what he asked her to do, plays along. Okay, so let me start sharing my slides. Now it should work. Yes, so as you can see here, I'm a professor of art education, but in my university, it's a little bit different from what it is in many places, because we actually don't train art teachers. So for me, with a background in aesthetics, I did my PhD at the University of Helsinki on environmental aesthetics, including urban environments. I see my present area as a kind of, in a sense, one way of applying aesthetics or bringing it into contact with real world issues. And when I got this position in Jyväskylä, I wasn't at all sure first that I could apply, because I thought that I'm not in education, but we are a humanities subject here. Anyway, it opened up new ideas. I mean, my new academic environment. And our students here do, many of them do kind of empirical qualitative research. So they have actually data. It can be interviews, or it can be, I mean, it's not like statistical data. And some of them write about young people and children. So I became interested in this. Which was then even more than today, perhaps a lacuna in humanities. I mean, we tend to think about the human being as an adult person. And so there is still looming, I think, the idea that children are not quite yet kind of interesting or worth taking seriously. My former colleague from Helsinki said, why are you interested in children? Because we have these special branches of research like pedagogy and psychology, and they are kind of the specialists on children. Well, I think that is a very narrow view, but I would say more about it now. I want to make some points about this area, and I have some kind of general points, and I have some examples also about what this means. Okay, I'm just adjusting my own screen. So. Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, yes, a methodological starting point, which is not so much just about aesthetics in childhood, but it's very relevant, I think, and important to keep in mind. You know that some people think and have defended art as a kind of Western practice, a cultural invention, like, for example, Larry Shiner's book, The Invention of Art. And also aesthetic experience as a kind of invention, something that people came up with in the late as 18th century, and art as something that is okay. We have it in the kind of Western world, which is now quite global, but that we should not apply it to practices in other parts of the world, because it would kind of distort them. But that's not my view. I'm not going to go deeply into that, but I think that we could rather look at the idea of art, the kind of general concept of art and aesthetic experience as discoveries. That especially, I mean, aesthetic experience and the kind of aesthetic dimension of a human being is something that maybe there were no words for it exactly like that earlier, but I think it captures something very important in our life. And we can use the concept for kind of meaningful discussions. So for me, art is always a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it's not a kind of universal thing in the sense that it would be the same thing everywhere, but in all human cultures, we have practices that we can designate as art. And here I agree with Dennis Dutton, for example, in his book, The Art Instinct, which is a kind of evolutionary discussion of why human beings create art. We don't have to agree with all about that, but I think generally I agree with his approach. So human communities create culture. We are cultural beings. Humans also communicate through language. I mean, children and grown-ups, once we learn language, we have it, and our life is suffused with language. And all cultures also have some practices that we can meaningfully call art. So I think that in that sense, I'm a kind of moderate naturalist, that I think that both art and aesthetic experience point to something that would exist even if we had no concept for it. And that's why it makes sense and is possible to talk about aesthetics in childhood, and even compare and look at the continuity that runs from many play practices in childhood to art in the adult world. So ontogenetically, we think about the kind of individual, which is always an individual in some group. We can also see that aesthetics in childhood is an existential aesthetics. If you think about a small child or even a newborn, it has a lot of capacities, and maybe not everything that we have later on, but it has no knowledge. So the younger the child, the more it needs to make sense of things all the time, because the world is not given, and also interaction is not habitual. Newborns, I'm going to say something about that, are very interested in other human beings and willing to communicate from the start, but they haven't learned how to do it. They know their own body, and they have heard they can recognize their mother tongue, for example, upon birth, because they have heard it around from within the womb, and they recognize their mother's voice and so on. But they, of course, many things that they are not used to. And when they become a little bit older, they start making sense of things all the time. I have a reference here to William Corsaro. At the end of these PowerPoint slides, there is a list of references also, but he's a sociologist of childhood, and he has in his books, he has a lot of really interesting examples of how children make sense and how differently they may apply certain concepts that are natural for us as adult human beings. For example, when Corsaro, he has worked a lot in Italian nurseries. He is an American, but and his kind of family is Italian, but his Italian is not so good. So once when he was doing observations in an Italian daycare center, someone came and rang the door, and Corsaro, who has taken the role of not being an adult, so he is among the children in a sense without taking the adult role, responsibility, and so on. went to open the door, and then a 3-year-old Italian boy said that you shouldn't ask Bill because he's so small, he can't even talk properly yet. So the other kids, took him to be a child because that was the kind of role he took. So it's not about size. That's just one example. So an existential aesthetics means that you have to make sense, you have to use your imagination, you have to explore things all the time and test what works in situations. Aesthetics in childhood is also very highly a social thing. In the Western tradition, we tend to think about not just aesthetics and art, but also many other things from the point of view of one individual with something. But in childhood, this sharing, intersubjectivity, being with others is central. So in shared situations, self and world are formed and transformed, affirmed and tested. And then communicative and performative agency is primary and develops into rituals and practices, and then into works and worlds. And I'm going to go through that to some extent. But what is important is, I think that we can really see a continuity from play in childhood to art through gradual rather than abrupt changes, including such things which we tend to think about philosophically, like reflexivity, that you become aware of yourself and you become a self. Anyway, so action comes before objects, and I think that here also a kind of traditional developmental psychology, which has, for example, emphasized how babies are interested in certain geometrical forms. It's actually not the case, and Piaget wasn't quite right here. What is first and foremost interesting is expressive persons, human beings, faces that move, not just faces like still images. Here is, before I go systematically through certain things, facial gestures in infants has been discussed a lot, and the man you can see here in this image and the is Andrew Meltzoff, and he's a cognitivist, developmental psychologist, still very active, but he actually tested or found out this how babies, even newborns, respond to facial gestures when he had his first own child. And these are kind of a classical series of images. The adult shows his tongue, the infant responds by showing its tongue. He opens his mouth, and the infant opens its mouth, and so on and so forth. So there are various explanations of this in the kind of the cognitivist side of research. Meltzoff himself has proposed a like-me hypothesis, that the infant somehow would through certain kind of brain mechanisms, would recognize that this is someone who is like me, and then it would kind of rationally come to the conclusion that that person is showing tongue, and then I can show my tongue. But it's a kind of computational explanation he comes up with, which I'm not going to go into, but I've discussed it in the article that you can see here on the down on this slide, on equal terms, on implementing infants' cultural rights. And on this slide, you can, Emma at 2 weeks, this was is my bonus granddaughter, whom I met in Copenhagen. And I took her in my lap, and I had, at that point, I was familiar with these discussions about facial gestures. So I held her and I looked at her, and she seemed to look back, although she had very dark blue eyes, so I couldn't see exactly where she was focusing. But then, inspired by these discussions I knew about, and I was a bit not sure about the explanation was the right one, I showed my tongue. And after a short while, she showed her tongue, and then put my tongue in one corner of the mouth, and she responded with the same gesture symmetrically. So if I put my tongue in the left-hand corner of my mouth, she would put hers in the right-hand corner, and then we stopped. Because for people that age, a lot of things goes on in the brain, so usually they are not don't have the energy to do the same thing for a very long time. But the interesting thing is that a few days later, when I held her again, she started this game. She showed her tongue and I showed mine, and so on. And I think this shows that it is not just a question of imitation, also because she didn't do this thing with other people, but she initiated the game with me, recognizing that I was the lady or whatever, the being with whom you can do this. So I would say that this is a play, and I would also say that the reason she recognized me and my face is that already the fetus, or in the womb, before birth, we investigate our own bodies, and so it's a kind of a baby knows what a nose is and what a mouth is, and so on. So I think the spatially have a kind of internalized these things. This is, of course, speculation. No one knows exactly what they kind of think, these infants, but I think my explanation is a more kind of a better one, because it's more simple. It also points to the continuity between an infant and an adult. I mean, that we're not that different human beings. And it also points to continuity between aesthetics and in childhood and in adult life. This is a map where I just briefly want to show you what things, what the kind of a map of aesthetics in childhood. It's about the human beings as aesthetic being, about the playful, homo ludens, about creative and productive, making things, homo faber, but also political. And I think that in childhood, play and even lying, which I have written about, is sometimes a way of influencing kind of a world where the child lives and where it is always under the power of adults. So using a kind of aesthetic means can be a way of pointing to and saying something which this person who has less power than the adults cannot maybe say directly, because then the answer would be that no, we know what's best, or no, we shouldn't do that, or so on, or why that's silly, and so on. Anyway, so that's the red here, and then what kind of feeds into this aesthetics in childhood in my own research is, of course, aesthetics and art theory, but also childhood studies, which is a kind of multidisciplinary field which has started from sociology, and where the ethos is to look at children as cultural agents. So agency is a very important concept there, and not just looking at children as future adults, but trying to understand what they are in their own right, beings and not just becomings. But also developmental psychology, I refer to Meltzoff, and I'm a bit critical against that kind of what I call the cognitivist approach, but there is also kind of another approach within developmental psychology, which, well, we might call existential, but where the people want to think about what it is like to be an infant or a child, kind of rather than kind of reducing that being to something in a certain developmental stage. And in the middle of this picture, there's imagination, communication, and memory. So a suggestion that childhood is actually suffused with an aesthetic mode of agency, or aesthetic modes of agency in the plural, if you want, which we might call a synthesizing mode of embodied thought and action, involving senses, emotions, values, imagination, and reflection. and which is exploratively directed at and creating particular individual objects in context or in situations, rather than abstractions and generalities. Yeah, so now I'm going into the more kind of specific themes or angles which I see and which I have kind of dealt with also. They are overlapping. This is not just about the kind of how should we say? It's not just the way that you start with one and then go to the other and then to the third. But on the other hand, there is a certain chronology to this also in human development. So what's already there from the start is movement and rhythm and life before mind, which is something that, I mean, has been also discussed in philosophy. I think Jacques Derrida, for example, in his book on the animal that thus I am, is it that right in English, also proposes that when we think about ourselves, we might start with life rather than with mind. It's an interesting idea, and it fits into this aesthetics in childhood and aesthetics before childhood in the life of the fetus, as I want to suggest in a moment. Then secondly, interaction, communication before language. The newborn and the infant is already a very communication-oriented human being, and language comes on top of that, or words come on top of that. So we start with improvisational, communicational events, which quite quickly become rituals. If any of you have children, you know how easily it goes, or naturally it goes, that you say certain things and you sing certain things and so on in certain moments when the small one wakes up or goes to sleep or so on. So small plays are created by both parties reciprocally very early on. So from sharing to self and reflectivity, I will talk more about that too. And then the third angle is narratives, play and make-believe, where we get towards works and worlds. So performative works, certain things, certain plays that a parent and a child or children among themselves can play over and over again. So it's not just playing, but it's also a play in the kind of theatrical sense or performance. And then the worlds, the kind of imaginary worlds that are created in childhood, which could be compared to the worlds of literature or in cinema, for example. I'm from Finland, so I could mention Aki Kaurismäki, the film director, who seems to kind of deal with the same world and explore it again and again in his films. It's kind of particular parallel world to the one where we live, which is similar but yet different, and through which you can say something about where we are. Okay, I'm now going to deal with these, discuss these three angles or themes. And if you want, you can of course ask something while I'm talking. I think I will see the chat, but otherwise I will try to reserve some time for questions and answers at the end. So movement. The first one is about movement and rhythm and life before mind. And here is one important researcher in this respect, Daniel Stern, who was a child psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and whatnot. Forms of Vitality was his last book, and in that book he explores a dynamic experience in psychotherapy psychology, the arts, psychotherapy, and development. And he says, I mean, this is just some very briefly highlights that already the movements of the fetus are intentional at a very early stage. They are not mechanical. He points out that already at 12 weeks, the fetus moves in a kind of graceful way. And then he points out that these kind of individual expressive movements, or the individual movements, carry meaning, expressive meaning, which is similar to the meaning we find in performing arts, especially such as dance and music. This is very, very briefly, but it's interesting, and he calls these forms of vitality. Earlier, he also talked about affectivity forms. These are really similar to the philosopher Frank Sibley's aesthetic concepts in his article from 1959, where he points to individual properties that carry expressive meaning in the arts, and Sibley writes about visual art. And we point to such qualities with terms that are like the ones you see on this list. For Sibley, these terms sometimes function aesthetically, and sometimes they are just used in a kind of non-aesthetic way. But for both Stern and Sibley, it's actually about individual movements. So whatever term you use, it might always be too coarse or too broad. But movement is expressive and meaningful from the start. So if we follow Stern, there is an innate meaning in movement, kind of basis for sharing and communicating. The movement and action come first, and then we might also note that at this stage, the human being, the very young human being, is a multimodal being. The senses function together, not separately, like also Merleau-Ponty, whom I'm not going to refer to here, but I'm actually very much inspired by, also pointed out. And this is also how we as adults experience the world. I mean, primarily, we kind of taught to look separately at sense modalities, but the kind of natural way is to experience the bus that is approaching, rather than a kind of so-and-so colored form coming with I mean, we experience it with the smell, with the sound, with everything. Another point, that the development takes place in a continuum, not through stages, but in overlapping phases. Well, this is kind of general point about the aesthetic in childhood, might have been in another place. And as I said, there is an innate basis of our expressive and communicative abilities, both as kind of understanding others and expressing ourselves. So the second part, I'm going to the second angle or theme now. Interaction, communication before language. And here we have this really interesting concept of communicative musicality and all the research that comes with it, where Pauline von Bonsdorff, originally from New Zealand, but for a long time then professor in Edinburgh. I'm not sure how active he is. He's already 90, but he's a very prolific researcher, both in brain science and neurobiology, but also very open to the arts, and that's how I found him. Kind of perhaps rather not so mystical quote: "Love comes before play, comes before work." But what Colvin Trevarten very strongly emphasizes is that what is first is kind of interest, the will to communicate with other human beings. That's what we call it, primary intersubjectivity, and then secondary intersubjectivity. But that's there from the very, very start. So he edited this book, Communicative Musicality, together with Stephen Mallock, who is a musicologist and a musician. And I quote here, he was listening to, I mean, they were doing research on how mothers and babies communicate. So they were filming them at that point in the 70s, and then analyzing the tapes from the point of view of the vocalization, to what goes on. And Mallock was doing this analysis, and as he listened to the tape, he began to tap his foot, and then he could sense, just shortening this a bit, sense a distinct rhythmicity and melodious give and take to the gentle prompting of Laura's mother and the pitched vocal replies from Laura. So what's important is that the mother was talking to the baby in the kind of voice that we use most parts of the world, or all parts of the world, with babies, how are you doing, and so on. And then the baby is responding. The small babies, of course, they don't have words, and they maybe not say so much, but what this researchers suggest is that the mother or the parent and the baby together actually create melodies, so that it is music. Now again, this music and communicative musicality is multimodal, so it's gestural with looking, pointing, vocalizing, touching. It's a kind of whole body communication. It's not music only in the sense of hearing. And there have also been, research on deaf babies where, similar kind of communication, very intimate, very kind of other directed and improvisational goes on. We might perhaps call this also aesthetic communication instead of just communicative musicality. Cervantes and also interesting uses terms like narratives, musical narratives. The melodies are narratives based on imagination as an explorative, creative, forward-looking capacity. So creativity and imagination are very closely related, and I think it's fascinating that he, as a natural scientist, is so much into using these words, and I can say again that it has inspired me a lot. Action songs provide opportunities for performing, for playing and modifying. Here, when I mention action songs, I mean this kind of that we learn as children, and we perhaps again perform them with our own children. These are plays, and there is this video of Japanese baby where the mother is singing and the baby is sitting opposite her and is kind of taking part in this performance and moving arms together with the mother. But then at one point the baby looks at the camera because they are being filmed and says "ha-ha," and Colin Trevarten points out that this is an ironic laugh. And so it is clear, whether it's ironic or not, it is clear that the baby is aware of the situation, that is performing with mother, but also for someone else. On the other hand, it might be that already when we perform with another without any kind of outer audience, there is a kind of operative intentionality in this performance. So I'm doing this, but I'm also aware of doing this. And this becomes very clear in this Japanese case where the baby shows it. Then still from communicative musicality, it has also been shown that toddlers experience music as a kind of company. Or it looks like they behave in the same way with music as they do with other people. Yeah, so these repeated rituals, like either improvised rituals that may arise between a parent and a child in a family, or action songs, become something that we can get back to and remember and make variations on. So they also kind of they also help creating a world, kind of giving stability to the world. This is something that we do, and now we do it again, and yeah. So here again, I think it's the action and the agency and the doing and the performing that is primary, as compared to, for example, the stability that is created through objects, which is of course also there. This is at least what I would like to suggest. And moreover, the performing such rituals constitute certain modes of being together. This is from Stern, from another book, and become part of who we are. So this very briefly, I have talked about this kind of thinking. It opens perspectives on meaning and expression in the arts, I think, but also on how we understand other people. And that's the next thing in this theme. Vasudev Reddy, who is a professor of psychology in Portsmouth, published a lot, but also a book on how infants know mind. And she points out that there is actually, she thinks there is no gap between self and other, but we understand each other precisely in shared situation. It's because we can share an emotion that it becomes an entity, one which we then can name and share. And I realize I have to speed up a bit. She also says that mind is better seen as an adverb. We sit anxiously, step carefully, move confidently, pause thoughtfully, and so on, as a quality of action. And if we, to some extent, agree with this or think that it's relevant, then we can also directly see that this how of things, how we sit, how we step, and so on is I think already very central to aesthetics. Exactly is how this expressive dimension, active engagement, makes us into who we are. It's not just about information, it's about doing things together. I'm coming to the third theme, towards works and worlds. This is a picture from, which is, I think, again shows this kind of reflectivity. The boy Mark Lee, an adult by now, I'm sure, who has called this self-portrait. My teacher asked me to draw myself. There is already some irony in the title. Narrative, play, make-believe. So playfulness is part of infancy and develops into play practices in childhood, and children's possibilities to create in play grows with experience, and the world becomes larger but also more multi-layered. In play, children often articulate issues that are important for them. And creative play brings something into the world. Jennifer Anna Gossetti-Ferencei, who has written a whole book on imagination, in an article from 2014, she describes the mimetic dimension. One does not simply pretend the world, but maybe subject to its evocation in an imaginative mode. So it is a kind of dialogic experience, being in that world where things happen, but and we influence it, but they also kind of take over, like an author, for example, can say that I was going to write a novel about this and that, but then the characters wanted to go in a different way. So it's, again, I mean, it is similar. Marjorie Taylor has written about imaginary companions in childhood. Maybe I can just mention one example, the imaginary pony, because it shows this kind of political element of imaginary companions. A 3-year-old boy had an imaginary pony, and his parents decided that they would take him to a horse show, because he would probably be very happy about that, because he had this pony. But the boy wasn't happy at all. He said that he was kind of grumpy, and they asked, what is it? Why don't you like it? Is it fun? We're going to a horse show today, in an hour. And he said that no, the pony has other plans, so the pony couldn't come. And there has been explanations of this particular example, that they kind of the imagination took over and did kind of such things. But I think we could also see it from the child's perspective, in the way that the 3-year-old knows that he can't say that I'm busy, I can't come, but he could refer to this imaginary, for his parents, invisible pony, who had made other plans and couldn't come. So it was a way of making a point, and almost the political point in that kind of micro world. I mean, the family world, where this child is always the one who is the kind of has to obey what the adults say. There is also, in the famous books about Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren, the Swedish child author, examples of lying, which work in similar ways. And can't go into it now. This was an example which I may also have to skip, but there is a reference to it in an article of mine, but a boy in the 1920s and 30s who created a political world with his kind of toy animals, where the bears were the royal family and the monkeys were social democrats, and so on and so forth. There was also a banker, here you see him at the right-hand side, who went bankrupt after the collapse of the stock exchange in 1929. Interestingly, as an adult, this boy became a professor of political science. Anyway, so conclusion to sum up, there is an ubiquity of aesthetics in childhood, from these expressive dynamic forms of vitality to playful communication, improvisation, performance, to rituals, performances, scripted plays, those we can perform again and again, and with variations, and mimetic worlds. Children's aesthetic agency is transformative, both receptive and creative at the same time, multimodal and social. So it often typically takes place with others, but of course also alone. But I can be with others is a very central aspect. And I think that aesthetics as a discipline and tradition can help us understand childhood and children more deeply. Maybe you can agree with that, but I also think that the other way is true, that childhood and children gives interesting perspectives on the role of aesthetics and arts in human life. So this is where I end, and this is the same baby as you saw in the beginning, and with his grandfather Göran, who was the inventor of the kingdom of Ström in the 20s and 30s. So I stop here. There is a list of references, some of my own articles, and then also some general references at the end. Thanks a lot, and sorry for talking too long, I think.
Thanks so much, Pauline. There's nothing to be sorry for. It was very, very rigorous. And before we move on to Vishwam, who just joined us, I do have a quick question because we have a few minutes. I'm really, really thankful to you for giving this talk, because for me, a father of two kids, one is 2.5, another one is 11, it's a really profound topic, and partly because they have different mothers, and we've had no grandparents around, and I have brought them up full time pretty much. And the thing that, obviously things, or I hope things in Finland are much better than they are in Australia, but having had these experiences strictly in Australia, I've been facing real barriers, social barriers, all through the last 12 years. And so what I wanted to say is simple. In my opinion, the child is the ultimate other. Our world is not structured around children. And my partner is currently writing a PhD on this topic through poetry. Our world is structured around work, around people working. And so if you're a parent, say if you're a mother, you are given 1 year, right? You're on maternity leave, then you need to go back to work. And where does your child go? No one knows, to some kindergarten and so on. If you're a father like myself, you are expected in any country to be back to work in a month, often maybe in a couple of months, and to end up spending with your kid an hour in the evening, maybe 2 hours if you're not, if you're very strong and if you're not tired. So what we're facing are really serious social, political issues where we have these great superstructures of research that you have introduced us to in part, which are amazing, and there's so much to learn. But in practice, how do we actually implement all these beautiful findings in lives where we're pulled apart by different commitments, which have actually little to do with our kids?
Yeah, can I just respond briefly? Because I think that you are very right. And on the other hand, I wrote this text on aesthetic practices for your your collection, and there you yourself pointed to Aristotle and how he said that school is the kind of, and it meant kind of free time, that's what should be central in a kind of intrinsically valuable in a human being's life. And I think this is so ironic, because the school, which could be a resource in this respect, I mean school and kindergartens and so on, they have become really working places. I mean, school in Finland is rather, I mean, it's children learn, but they also, the older they become, the more depressed they come, because the school has forgotten, I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but the value of the arts, and yet the school could be a place for that. In Finland, we have in the nurseries and kindergartens, there is a lot of kind of, it's much less structured than in many other countries. So I sometimes say that the reason that Finnish kids do pretty well might be that they have a long childhood. They go to school first, and only when they are 7, and until that they are, whether they are in kindergarten or at home, they are allowed to have a lot of kind of free play. So, but anyway, this is of course not a kind of sufficient response, but on the whole, I agree with you. Yeah. And I think that as much as, I mean, you should just have fun with your children. They also need, of course, food and all those things. But it's that's what you remember then from your maybe parents, that you used to play something with dad or so on. Thanks.